2 hours ago, the White House dropped something unprecedented. Not sanctions, not tariffs, a complete federal roadblock on Canadian food imports. Effective in 48 hours. Fresh produce, grain, dairy, processed foods, even the fertilizer that American farms need to grow anything. They didn't call it a ban, of course. They called it an emergency agricultural security review. Sounds reasonable, right? Here's what that actually means. Every single Canadian food shipment crossing the border needs individual federal clearance. Individual. For each truck. Look at the math. About 28,000 food trucks cross from Canada every week. The federal agency handling these clearances? They can review maybe 200 shipments per day. The border doesn't technically close. It just becomes so impossibly slow it might as well be a wall. 40 million Americans live in areas that depend on Canadian agricultural networks. Not because American farms can't produce food, they absolutely can. But over 60 years, we built this integrated continental system where Canadian supply fills specific gaps. Seasonal stuff, geographic coverage, commodity shortfalls that domestic production doesn't handle. Rip that out without warning, without transition, without replacement? Those 40 million people are about to discover what was invisible until it vanishes. The directive has 3 parts. Each sounds reasonable alone. Together, devastating. First, all Canadian fresh produce gets the new clearance protocol in 48 hours. Canada's greenhouse industry, concentrated in Ontario and BC, produces most of the tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, lettuce that stock shelves from Boston to Chicago between October and May. These aren't luxury items. This is basic produce when American outdoor agriculture is dormant. The 48-hour requirement doesn't phase anything out. It just stops trucks at the border while paperwork piles up. Second, Canadian grain and oilseed shipments are now strategic commodities requiring Department of Agriculture national security certification. Canadian canola oil? That's a huge chunk of the cooking oil in American packaged food manufacturing. The certification process has no timeline. Pending certification means shipments wait. Factory lines don't wait, they stop. Third, and agricultural economists spotted this immediately as the most damaging, all Canadian fertilizer exports get the same clearance protocol. Because fertilizer isn't food. Fertilizer makes asterisk next season's food possible. American farms that can't get Canadian potash during spring planting don't just have a supply problem this year. They have a yield problem next year. The directive isn't just blocking Canadian food today, it's sabotaging the inputs that produce American food for the next growing cycle. Washington's internal name for this strategy, pantry pressure. The logic was clinical. Block food flow, hurt both sides simultaneously. But they calculated Canadian farmers facing closed American markets would force Carney into settlement within 30 days before American consumers felt real impact at the shelf level. Thing is, Carney had been watching pantry pressure develop for 7 months, and he'd spent 7 months making sure that when it arrived, the pressure would run in exactly one direction. 51 minutes after the directive went public, Carney didn't walk to some government podium. He walked into a farmers' cooperative in Leamington, Ontario, greenhouse capital of Canada, and stood among workers and equipment. No prepared text, no teleprompter, no flanking officials. He opened with a question for American viewers. When you go to the grocery store this week, look at where your produce comes from. Many of those labels say Canada. Your government just decided those labels are a national security threat. Let me tell you what's actually a national security threat. Then he announced 4 responses, each one already operational before he reached that podium. First countermeasure, Canada immediately activated pre-negotiated agricultural supply agreements with the UK, EU, Japan, and South Korea. Agreements signed over the previous 7 months, held in reserve, released the moment the directive became public. That canola flowing to American processors now flows to European and Asian buyers who've been waiting for exactly this supply. Canadian farmers don't face market loss, they face market shift. American food processors face supply loss with no equivalent replacement at comparable price or volume. Canadian farmers won't go hungry because Washington closed a door. We built 7 other doors. What Washington didn't build is a replacement for what it just blocked. The second countermeasure made agricultural economists across North America grab their calculators. Canada immediately suspended all potash exports to the United States. Not slowing, not reviewing, suspending. In 24 hours, Canada produces about 35% of the world's potash supply. Spring planting window for American corn and soybean production opens in roughly 6 weeks. Potash that doesn't arrive before that window doesn't make next season's harvest smaller. It eliminates yield from fields that stay unfertilized. American farmers aren't being told food will cost more. They're being told their fields may not produce what they planned. Corn futures moved within minutes. Soybean futures moved. Every fertilizer-dependent commodity repriced in a single afternoon. But here's where the response reveals something that went way beyond the specific dispute. Third countermeasure targeted not Washington, but American consumers directly. Canada coordinated with the Canadian Food Exporters Association to launch a live, updating public database accessible to any American consumer, showing which supply lines are backing up at the border, which products get affected first, which stores in which regions will see empty shelves if the clearance backlog isn't resolved. Not predictions, not warnings. A tracker updated in real time, attributing every shortage directly to the federal clearance directive. The directive was designed to apply diffuse, gradual pressure over weeks. The tracker converts it into immediate, visible, attributable impact. Every empty produce shelf becomes a data point. Every data point carries a label. Every label says blocked by federal clearance directive. The political geography of American grocery shopping overlaps almost perfectly with American swing states. Washington understood the implication before Carney finished speaking. Fourth countermeasure was the one the White House hadn't modeled. Canada activated its Agricultural Sovereignty Protocol, a framework developed with Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and Australia, triggering coordinated review of agricultural export terms to the United States across all 5 nations simultaneously. Not a ban, a review, but coordinated review across 5 nations that collectively supply a massive portion of American food imports means every agricultural supply line touching American shores is now under simultaneous re-examination. The message is precise. Coerce one food exporter and you activate the response architecture of all of them. The room in Leamington went silent after he finished. Then someone started clapping. Then the whole room. The American food industry's reaction arrived faster than any previous corporate response in this confrontation. The Grocery Manufacturers Association called the clearance protocol an immediate and unmanageable disruption to supply chains that American consumers rely on for daily food security. The American Farm Bureau called the potash suspension a direct threat to American crop yields with consequences extending through multiple growing seasons. The Food Industry Association, representing over 40,000 grocery locations, warned of visible shelf-level impact within 2 weeks if the backlog isn't resolved. These aren't Canadian voices. These are the organizations that feed America, telling their own president he just disrupted the most politically sensitive consumer category that exists. Republican voices in farm states broke from the White House without waiting for coordination. Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, and Minnesota governors issued a joint statement demanding immediate fertilizer exemption. The senior Republican senator from Iowa called the potash suspension a threat to American food production that cannot be justified by any trade policy objective. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization expressed concern about food supply being weaponized as bilateral pressure. The European Union called it unprecedented between allied nations. Brazil and Argentina, activating the protocol alongside Canada, issued statements with particular weight. Both nations understand what it means to treat food as a weapon. The structural reality no clearance protocol can change. From October through May, American domestic greenhouse production can't cover northeastern and midwestern produce demand. That gap has been filled by Canadian supply for decades. There's no equivalent alternative at comparable scale, price, or transit time. Supply chains don't reroute around closed borders, they deplete. The potash calendar is even less forgiving. Spring planting window doesn't move because supply chains got disrupted. The window closes. Yield drops. Multiply that across Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Missouri, and the production impact hits grocery prices within months. Trump has three paths. None lead back to where he was this morning. Enforce the directive fully and watch the live tracker document empty shelves across swing states while 5 nations maintain simultaneous review of American agricultural access and corn and soybean futures keep moving toward the planting window. Walk it back, but Canada's alternative supply contracts are already signed. Those counterparties won't step aside because Washington reversed course. Canadian agricultural exporters who spent 7 months negotiating alternatives will maintain them, because Washington just demonstrated in writing that it views their supply as a pressure instrument. Escalate and convert coordinated review into coordinated restriction across all 5 protocol nations simultaneously. 2 hours ago, the White House looked at the continental food system and saw leverage. What it found was the one resource American voters track not in financial headlines or intelligence briefings, but in the produce aisle at eye level on a Tuesday afternoon. Carney stood in that greenhouse in Leamington and didn't speak to governments, markets, or legal panels. He spoke to the person pushing a cart past the tomato display in a grocery store in Columbus, Ohio. He told them what happened to their produce, who decided it, and where to look to see it themselves. The most powerful constituency in this confrontation was never the Senate, never Wall Street, never allied governments. It was the American grocery shop. And now they know.